Hi, it's Rick Prescott here for Save the Beatles, my book about the rescued albums 1970 to 1982. As a Beatles fan, you know that that's after they broke up. So what's this all about? Well, in earlier videos, I've talked a little bit about the basic concept. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about the process of bringing all the parts together. I talked a little bit in the previous video about how the different eras in which the band operated and the different methods in which they operated suggested that such a thing might be possible for the 70s if they hadn't all really just kind of hated each other at that time. Maybe that's a little bit strong. They didn't all hate each other, but they were having all kinds of problems, as we know. It's all very, very well documented. Had they decided in 1969, September of 1969 specifically, as is suggested by the phone call with Ringo that the recording now has surfaced, had they decided to continue with just a different method of working, they might have been able to continue the band into the 70s, creating great albums while avoiding some of the personal strife that they ended up having between them. One of the critical pieces to that is that once all the recording had taken place, it would have been necessary for someone to sort through all of the recordings and decide what went on an album and how that album, what the order, the sequencing of that album was going to be. So to understand how that, first of all, to explain how that was even possible, think about what they did with Let It Be. They recorded a bunch of stuff. They had stacks and stacks of tape. Nobody could face it. They took it all, they handed it to Phil Spector, and they said, Phil, go do your thing. And Phil fished through, I don't think he listened to everything, but he fished through those tracks that Glyn Johns had marked, and he pulled out what he thought was good, and he added some stuff, and he removed some stuff, and he sequenced them, and he turned it into an album. And the process of creating Let It Be was just exactly the process that I am imagining for the next part of the 70s. The Beatles record, they hand their materials to somebody else, and that somebody else takes and puts them in the context of an album. Now, before you think that that's a little bit too far, think back to the early days. The earliest albums, Please Please Me and With the Beatles and A Hard Day's Night, they did almost exactly the same thing. They went into the studio, they recorded a bunch of stuff, they handed it over to George Martin. George Martin fished through it, George Martin added stuff, removed stuff, pulled out the best of it, put it in an order, and created the album that way. From almost the very beginning, the way the Beatles worked was, we will do the recording, you take it and make it sound good to the rest of the world. So what I'm imagining for the 70s, the process I'm imagining for the 70s, was something they had already done. In fact, they had already done it many, many times. Now, it's true, there are exceptions. The White Album is an exception. Abbey Road is an exception. Sgt. Pepper is not, because all of their recordings they handed to George Martin, and he did the sequencing on those as well. And there's a lot of documentary evidence about that out there. So my thought was, instead of breaking up in 1969, after they've had this conversation with Ringo, who's in the hospital, over the phone, they decide this is how we're going to do it. We are going to go our separate ways. We're going to record wherever, whenever, with whomever we want. And when the time comes that we need a new album, we are going to put all of our material together and give it to somebody to fish through, to add things and remove things and sequence it into the finished product. So what I am imagining is that the person who would have done that would have, in a best case scenario, been George Martin. But as we know, by 1970, George Martin was kind of ready to move on. And instead, I'm just going to assume in this book that there is someone that the Beatles felt they could trust, that they would hand their music to, who would have the abilities, who would understand at least how George Martin did things, and then could take the recordings that they made and give them that sheen, that Beatles sheen that they always had. It could give them the right sequence to highlight the best tracks and hide the weakest tracks, or at least mitigate some of the problems. And though I would love to say that it's George Martin doing that, all I can say is that it's someone who understands George Martin's principles. Once you have read the first section of this book, you will understand George Martin's principles and how he did that. You could become the assembler. For all intents and purposes for this project, I'm the assembler, but I'm also trying to set aside what I would do, because my background is in the recording arts, and I've sequenced many albums, and I have helped bands and solo artists and things like that. But I'm trying to set aside what I would do and yield to what I know George Martin's documentation says he might have done. Of course, at the same time, I realize that pretty much everything I've ever done was informed by George Martin's principles because I liked them. So I'm sort of in a good position to do that. But you might come up with something different, and I'm happy with that. If you have something different, I would love to hear it. That's how I approach that. So our assembler, there are a couple things that they have to decide about our assembler. And the first is that the Beatles feel like it's somebody they can trust, which is why George Martin comes to mind. But it could have been any number of other people. I really just didn't feel like I should pick somebody and say, oh, it's Jeff Emmerich, or it's, who else could, there's somebody from, I can't think of other people from Apple who might have, there are other people in Apple who might have been able to do that. So I'm just saying that there is somebody, we don't know who it is, it doesn't, person has a name, we're just calling him the assembler, but the Beatles feel like they can trust him. And in order for that to work, they have to step away. They have to do what they did with Phil Spector and with George Martin in the early days. They have to say, look, we have to approve the finished product, but we're not going to micromanage it. We are going to give it to you, you make your decisions, and then you bring it back to us. And then we'll say, well, either we agree or we don't agree, or we need these changes or whatever. But for the most part, the Beatles are rather disinterested at that point in how everything comes together as an album. They're focused on tracks, and that's the thing that I also talk about, is how everything they did was focused on tracks and not albums. That's a subject for a different video, which we will get to. So they trust the assembler, they hand everything to the assembler. There are some rules. The rules are things that were mentioned in that phone call, things like John and Paul and George each have the same number of tracks on an album. Ringo gets at least one. He has to be present on every album, despite the fact that he's not present on two of the classic Beatles albums. As a lead vocalist, at least, he's not present. And so they have those principles. They have to follow one principle that George Martin had that is not particularly well known, and that is that you could have no more than 2 songs in a row by the same songwriter on any of those albums. That's a principle that George Martin wrote about, that he always tried to maintain, so that there was some equity, some fairness. That if a Paul track could be followed by a John track, then it would be. And if a John track could be followed by a Paul or a George, that would be preferable to have 2 John tracks in a row, rather than having 2 John tracks in a row. So these are the kind of rules. Now, I have a chapter in here where I kind of distill all of those principles, the principles that George Martin established, and make sure that those are well understood before you start making your own playlists or album sequences. Because if you understand that, then you can say, well, at least we know that this would have passed muster with the Beatles. They would have been okay with it. There are other principles like that, and one of them is that the assembler decides which tracks get in and out. So a Beatle has made a track that he loves, but the assembler doesn't think it's very good. It doesn't make the album, and there's no recourse other than to put it out as a solo track. And that's one of the things that's assumed here too, is that despite the fact that the Beatles would continue as a group in the fused albums or the rescued albums, each would now start solo careers. That would be in tandem with the fused era, the fusion era. And I talk in here a bit about how the whole purpose of having a fusion era would have been to start the solo careers and have kind of a soft landing for the band rather than the huge blow up that they actually had. Is that better or worse? That's worthy of discussion. But if they could have continued by fusing albums from solo tracks and started solo careers at the same time, some of the worst missteps of the solo years might have been avoided. So that's part of it. The assembler helps with that by saying, yes, this is a Beatle track, that's a solo track. This is a Beatle track, that's a solo track. And basically, if that's that is something that the Beatles would have had to trust and would have had to yield to, despite the fact that they would have had to approve the finished product, there would have been lots of choices made along the way that were made by the assembler and that the Beatles themselves would not have been able to control. Can you imagine that? I don't know. I try and imagine it. I think it's possible, and I also think there could have been shenanigans. And I talk a little bit about the shenanigans in here too, how some Beatle might have had a really great track and decided that he wanted to keep it for a solo album and not given it to the assembler to consider for the group albums. So there are some rules in there about that as well. That's the basic concept of the assembler, and many of the portions of the fused album sections are from the assembler's point of view. In fact, all of the listening to the original tracks is from the point of view of, well, could this have gone on a fused Beatles album? Could this track from Venus and Mars have gone on a fused Beatles album? Could this track from Ringo IV have gone on a fused Beatles album? No. And things like that. That's the basics of the assembler. So there's much more about that in the book, Save the Beatles, The Rescued Albums 1970 to 1982, available anywhere you get books or at savethebeatles.com. And thanks for watching.